Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Richard Wolin. Richard is Distinguished Professor in Comparative Literature, History, and Political Science at City University of New York. He has done a lot of work on the Frankfurt School, French and German political thought. He's taught at a variety of places and written numerous books. Many have been translated into many different languages. And he is also the author of the latest book, Heidegger In Ruins, Between Philosophy and Ideology. As many have listened to the show, they will know that I'm a big fan of Heidegger's philosophy, and I've talked about him much on the podcast. And I saw this book. I knew it was coming out, and then I saw a lot of people reading it, and I also was reading it, and so I said, okay, I want to have this conversation with Richard. He is fantastic. He's very, very, very nice. We had a wonderful conversation, and I feel like we had a really honest conversation. And I want to say at the outset, I think a lot of people sometimes misunderstand some of his positions, even though he makes it kind of clear in his writings, that he's not necessarily anti-Heidegger in terms of his philosophy. I think that what he focuses on in his aim is to look at some of the personal aspects of Heidegger that are deeply troubling, and then also how that influences his philosophy and his thought. And what I walked away from in this conversation and reading the book, but really more from the conversation, is I think Richard's trying to just be critical. I don't necessarily even think he takes a side. I mean, he says numerous places we should read Heidegger, we should engage with his thoughts, but we should be critical. And I think his points that he makes is that we shouldn't just gloss over these really troubling components of Heidegger personally, and how much of that is in his thought. So I was very, very happy I had this conversation. Again, he was wonderful. A really great conversation. I really am proud of the conversation that we had. So we talk all about the book, and we talk about how the black notebooks of Heidegger were found, what their nature and intentions are. We talk about how do we read Heidegger's philosophy knowing he was anti-Semitic, knowing he was part of the Nazi Party. And to be fair, again, as I said, I've talked a lot about Heidegger. Anytime I talk about Heidegger on the podcast, I will make sure to mention this. I don't ever want, if someone's just here listening to that episode, to not know that. And that's not to just kind of, air all of Heidegger's dirty laundry of his personal life or his, political belief system. I think it's important to always remember that as well. And so I have never, I don't think, done anything that is just kind of glossing over anything about him. And I think you can definitely engage with his thought. You can understand the problematic nature and acknowledge it and maybe critique it and also study his philosophy. We talk about the extent of some of the pernicious views and destructive views, I would say in some ways, that Heidegger had personally, how much of that is in his works, such as in Being and Time. We talk about, obviously, Heidegger and the Nazi Party and him being a member of the Nazi Party. We talk about the editing and re-editing of his works. We talk about Heidegger's views on race. We talk about how his personal and political views, how does that impact his philosophy negatively or otherwise. We talk about the New Right, for such folks as Dugin and other folks in Western Europe that are forming these extreme far-right parties. And then we kind of end with, so how do we read Heidegger knowing all of these problematic issues? And something I kind of directly and pointedly ask Richard is like, look, you've done a lot of research in this. You've written at least a book on this and talked about this. So does that mean we don't read Being and Time? Does that mean we don't study his philosophy? And he very clearly and affirmatively says, no, we should read those things and we should critique it. So I was really, really, really pleased with the conversation. And I really hope it gets folks that are fans of Heidegger and maybe people that aren't fans of Heidegger to hopefully listen to the conversation and read his book and try and make your own kind of opinions or decisions about Heidegger and his place in philosophy, and how the larger theme is, how do we deal with folks that are troubling or have troubling views, but also have really amazing contributions to a field or a discipline as well. You can obviously see this in other examples, such as in the field of statistics. A lot of those folks that made a lot of statistic measures, we're eugenicists and we're pretty terrible in a lot of ways. But they also, help us understand other things to push our scientific method. So there's other examples of this in other areas as well. This is fine arts and in other films and books. And so we see this everywhere. And so I think there's some general application there. As always, you can listen to this conversation and all other conversations at my free Substack, convergingdialogues.substack.com. Get over there and subscribe so you can get this in your inbox. You can know when all the episodes that I post come out. You can listen to past episodes and upcoming episodes. I'm also on YouTube. You can find me there. Same thing, Converging Dialogues, and subscribe there and make sure you share widely. And now I bring you Richard Wolin. I am here with Richard Wolin. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So we'll get into your book, which is Heidegger in Ruins, Between Philosophy and Ideology. And as I was saying, it was well researched and very, very carefully considered. Many of the things of Heidegger and his work. So I really enjoyed reading it. And I've seen other folks have been reading it as well, and they've had a host of ideas and opinions about it. So I'm really excited to talk with you about many of the stuff, much of the stuff in the book. So before we get to it, just let listeners know is kind of the snapshot of who you are, your background academically and professionally, and what you're currently up to.
Sure. Well, I specialize, so to speak, in history of European ideas, and above all, political ideas. And I might say ideas pertaining to political extremes, far left and far right. Previously wrote a book on the impact of Mao Zedong's thought on the Western left, especially in France, the United States, during the 1960s, called The Wind from the East. And I had written before about Heidegger's political philosophy when these debates really got underway as a result of new archival research in the 90s, and was happily leading my life and my career, not paying so much attention to Heidegger, under the assumption that I'd contributed basically whatever I had to say. And then, the specter of Heidegger's political convictions in the 30s arose once more with these voluminous black notebooks in the circa 2014. And, despite myself or my preferences at the time, I was roped into giving some interviews and writing opinion pieces. And then I was offered a contract to write a short book on it, which is rather ironic given the fact that this book ended up being quite long. In fact, the manuscript I'd handed into my publisher was even longer. So consider yourself lucky that it was received at under, weighed in at slightly under 500 pages. about 15% of which is notes.
Mm-hmm.
But what I discovered quickly is that one can't treat these black notebooks. We can go into their nature in a few minutes, whatever, in isolation from the rest of his thought. Even though he started maintaining these philosophical notebooks in 1931, they do shed new light on his philosophical trajectory after World War I, and when he began teaching and worked as an assistant to Edmund Husserl at Freiburg. So, it just opened up. They are about several thousand pages, and they a lot of the materials show Heidegger reflecting on his previous itinerary. So it's hard to know exactly when to stop.
Yeah. No, that's nice the way you put it. So as I've mentioned, I've talked about Heidegger's thought and his philosophy many times on the podcast with a variety of wonderful guests. So we can skip all of the preliminaries in the intro. People know who he is. I guess I want to just get right to the core of it in terms of, so give us a little bit of you started a little bit there, a little bit of the context and the background of these black notebooks. Were they always known after his death in 70, 74, 70, 72, whenever he died in the 70s? Were they always known? Did they literally get unearthed somewhere in a box in his library? So how were they found? How did they come out? And how did we, scholars start to kind of pick apart some of these notebooks and say, wait a minute, what's this about? What are all these things? Kind of tell us the origins of how we got to this.
Yeah, it seems partly because of the title, Black Notebooks, would suggest mystery. There's some debate as to whether that was really Heidegger's title or intended title, or whether it's, to be blunt, something of a marketing strategy. We don't have any documentation in Heidegger's hand directly about either his intentions for this 102 volume, I think it's now 104 volume collected works edition, nor the Black Notebooks. It's mostly, the transaction was conducted between his last research assistant, the late Friedrich von Hermann was his name, and the publisher Klostermann. But to come to your question, it's much less mysterious than meets the eye, the origins. He mentions them in the late 30s in another the so-called ontological historical treatises, fat treatises that he was writing at the time. He didn't publish them, but he had a specific division. There were 4 divisions to his collected works that he intended to put these treatises. But he mentions hesitatingly or sketchily the outline of his collected works and what will be in them. And there is a reference to these philosophical notebooks, and he calls them by the titles of the individual volumes. So we have in German, it's the first volumes are Überlegungen, which is considerations or reflections, and then the second, there are now 8 volumes published, and that's how he refers to them, not as the Black Notebooks. But so these were slated, and he also slated them to be the last 8 volumes of this mammoth collected works edition. Why did he? So he held them in high esteem. What are they? Well, it's not a treatise. It's not a continuing argument. They're somewhat, you might say, fragmentary, but they weren't intended as a part of a larger work. Some authors, write notes that they intend to integrate into a larger magnum opus or something. That wasn't the idea. So, it kind of varies between philosophical seriousness and ad hoc reflections on the zeitgeist or the politics of the 30s. But what's important is, and what sheds new light on his self-understanding in the 1930s, is that he attempts to link. I took a look at your questions. You mentioned this so-called turn. In German, it's Kehre, in his work from the Dasein-centered approach of being in time to his concern with being, or the history of being, or the sendings of being, or wants to talk about in the 30s. He tries to correlate this turn in his work to the history of being, or directly to what he called the idea of being, with contemporary political events. And that's especially true of the first few volumes of the Black Notebooks. And then later in the 30s, as the specter of war approaches and the crisis becomes more acute in Europe, again, the reflections turn to what you call in European parlance actualities, or contemporary events, current events. So that becomes more pointed at the beginning of the notebooks and at the end. One other aspect, of course, that's especially valuable and insightful. Part of the notebooks, early notebooks, speak to his approximately 1 year period as rector of Freiburg University from May 1933 to April of 1934, and that's illuminating. He's reflecting on the dawn of the National Socialist Revolution, and a lot is indeterminate in the first year. I'd say by August 34, when the old geezer, General Hindenburg, who's the president of Germany in his mid-80s, dies, and Hitler combines both offices, then all bets are off and you have a full-blown dictatorship. But it was consolidated pretty quickly within the first several months. But it wasn't clear what role intellectuals or philosophers might have. There was a lot to be determined.
Yeah, this is a nice overview. I think the thing that's interesting is so my understanding is that these are type of almost like I guess not an ancillary commentary on his own work, I guess, but something kind of as an addendum to his big, complete works or what have you. And much of the time, people would not really care or say it was interesting for Heidegger scholars. I think what becomes most illuminating from them is very clearly lots of anti-Semitic statements. Very clearly, obviously, he was a part of the Nazi Party, and so a lot of the Nazism. So I guess the main question I have is from the Black Notebooks, and this is what a lot of people will try to say as to why Heidegger is so problematic, is this kind of close association with Hitler, or this kind of reverence for him and things like that. And people obviously will have issues with someone that's speaking of somebody that way. I guess if the intentions of the Black Notebooks are somewhat fuzzy, I guess, how do we take these direct claims of anti-Semitism and of Nazism from there, and what do we do with it? And more importantly, connected with that is, how do we then look at the rest of his writings and his philosophical thought with those types of themes?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of important interpretive questions that the Black Notebooks raise in terms of Heidegger's allegiances to what one calls in German history Germany's special patch, or as I put it in the book, and Heidegger at times, his Seinsfrage, or question of being, takes on an apocalyptic or eschatological guise. there was the conviction that somehow there was a redemptive mission for Germany or Deutschtum, and the anti-Semitism, which, as you indicate, sometimes is explicit, sometimes is implicit, goes along with that, because they're in German radical right thinking after World War I, especially, although it's a tendency that emerged many decades earlier, but it was muted at that point, and there were countervailing political and cultural tendencies earlier on. This opposition between Germanity or Deutschtum and Jewishness was a very important opposition, or set of antitheses, as if one precluded the other. This was true of Völkisch nationalists, far-right nationalists. Wagner's famous essay on the Jews in music from 1850 ends with an appeal for that Jews disappear somehow, that they perish. Actually, Untergehen is the word he uses. Untergang, it's in Spengler. So there is an ideological consistency here. So, the question is tricky, or the way it's posed can be tricky, because it can suggest that, well, if we just get the anti-Semitism out of here, then we don't have to worry about any of this other stuff. And were that only true? Because, in fact, there were a number of interpreters who have actually counted the number of times that Heidegger uses the phrase Jews or Jewishness or world Jewry, or the passages where this appears, and they can kind of quarantine it that way. But as I said, word only so simple, that there's a much greater attachment, as one sees in the Black Notebooks, to what I call, generally speaking, Marx used this phrase in 1846, the German ideology. But the German ideology underwent transformations and a radicalization, especially after World War I. And Heidegger, we look now, not just the Black Notebooks, there have been volumes of letters, and there have been other treatises and seminars that have come out, and now we can see how he was fascinated by these tropes of Germany's, eschatological mission. Now, it kind of tanked a bit, or was submerged during the 1920s, especially during the stability of the Weimar Republic, which was, a parliamentary regime, and despite the prejudices against it, it actually, from 24 to 29, 24, Germany overcame this terrible inflation, these images of wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks to buy a loaf of bread. 29, of course, the great crash, and then all bets were off. But for 5 years, it was fairly stable. And, the ideological assaults, the political assaults on Weimar democracy and the Weimar Republic that occurred within the first few years, from the left and from the right, had subsided. So one would presuppose that this political system was going to, persevere. Anyway, I hope that wasn't too long-winded, but I think,
no, it's okay.
One could legitimately ask oneself, well, the 20s, we look at his texts and they don't seem very political. So this is just opportunistic. Namely the materials in the Black Notebooks or the speeches supporting Hitler in 33 and 34. But let's think about that and find out to what extent they were opportunistic, to what extent they were expressions of sincere conviction, not just political conviction. But this is the novelty, the new thing about the Black Notebooks, I think, how tied these ideological figures and tropes are to his philosophy. So it's not like the first debates about this topic. It's not a question of personal choices or biographical issues, which many of which have been settled. It's a question of how his philosophy in the early 30s, even before the Nazi seizure of power on January 30th, 1933, how these expectations and hopes played a role, the radicalization of his own philosophy, how this turn was correlated with a belief in the salvific mission of Germandom.
It's interesting. I remember wrestling with a lot of these ideas you were putting forth in the book, which I really enjoyed. I enjoy that. You say
Thank
in the
you.
book that the book is intended as a modest contribution to a more demanding and long-term process of rethinking and reconsideration, which I think is well said. Um, if, for example, let's say I didn't know the Black Notebooks existed, and and kind of what you're saying here is that we're seeing a lot of the things explicitly and sometimes implicitly, explicitly stated that are, terrible against not only Jews but also against, this elevation of kind of what you're saying, this kind of eschatological kind of notion of the Germanic people, X, Y, and Z. If I read Being in Time, 1927 is when that was published, would I be able to see a lot of these tropes, a lot of these ideas? In the book, it seems that you're positing, you correct me if I'm wrong, that you can see this. Now, I've read Being in Time, again, I don't speak German, I'm no Heidegger scholar, but I've read it a handful of times. And I mean, I think it would be something where is it one of those, let me ask this way. If I'm looking for it, could I see it? Or even if I'm not looking for it, could I see these types of ideas or tropes that are very, terrible about his views about, people and certain people groups in something like Being in Time, which is largely seen as a work of, ontology, et cetera. How
Mhm.
do you navigate that kind of world?
Yeah. Um, to be entirely straightforward, um, it's a as a preliminary remark. It's hard to see an English translation because the jargon of the conservative revolution, which Heidegger uses often, decisiveness, full community, generation. It's a reference pretty much to the front generation. Kampf is in there. This all occur. Most of this occurs in Division 2 on historicity, what's called authentic historicity. It's hard to see in translation because this idiom of the German radical right is so ensconced in the German language, and the words have special valences. For example, just real quick, this word that Heidegger used in German words, it's the word Entschlossenheit, or decisiveness, one might say, in an offhanded way. Decision becomes a really important word. Carl Schmitt in the late 20s coins the word decisionism, which is meant as a critique of so-called parliamentary rule of law and parliamentary normativism. The kind of rational promulgation of laws and legality, etc. So the German translation, and all translations are imperfect, especially in philosophy. Heidegger is very linguistically self-conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Is resolve. This is the way it's translated, resolve, which isn't unsupportable, but at the same time doesn't convey the connotations and the valences that root it in this larger linguistic framework that kind of gives it away. I mean, folk is in there too. Anyway, but to be more efficient here, it's not Nazi. I mean, the Nazis were nowhere in the mid-20s. They were nowhere until 1930 electorally. Hitler was the stuff of, I guess I've said this before, Charlie Chaplin humor and films, the great dictator. But as he warned in the 30s, he was going to have the last laugh, and almost did.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not Nazi. That doesn't make it, anodyne or non-threatening. There's a lot of course, as you indicated, this is a work in fundamental ontology. There are many important arguments and themes and recasting of the tradition of phenomenology along the lines of existential phenomenology. So it would be foolish, and I try to discredit this interpretation of my work to read it purely ideologically. But it is there. That's my point is that it's there in the concept of historicity. It's pointing toward a different kind of framework and temporality. It does harmonize and synchronize with many of the concerns of conservative revolutionary thinkers whom he read and admired, like Carl Schmitt. I mentioned Ernst Jünger, above all, who wrote The Worker. But I just am in favor of an equitable interpretation of the full range of his views, and not discrediting Heidegger, but also realizing the background here in the 1920s that led to his support of Nazism. It wasn't just a temporary support or a tepid support. He went whole hog. He went whole hog.
Right. Yeah, well, that was my next question. Is even if you're, reading Being in Time, let's say, even not even the later stuff in the 50s or whatever, you still have to have everybody that reads Heidegger has to have some sort. I mean, if you're an honest, ethical person, has to have some kind of reckoning of the fact that he was a member of the Nazi Party. So, let me ask you. In your mind, from your readings of both, primary stuff that he wrote, secondary literature, and historical documents, what can we say was his true involvement with Nazism? You clearly state in the book that he wasn't a Nazi philosopher. Maybe you could describe what that would have looked like, but that he was a member of the Nazi Party, and he spoke glowingly of the Nazi Party. He didn't. At least clearly, as my knowledge, even after the war, he kind of became a recluse in the 60s and 70s, didn't condemn any of the stuff from the Nazi Party. I mean, this is the stuff that really just makes him terribly frustrating to deal with, because it's like, okay, if I want the phenomenology and the ontology and some philosophy, it's pretty influential, I also have to deal with all this other nonsense that's terrible. It's like the worst, one of the worst things. So for you, what do you kind of make, or what's the kind of picture you paint of like his involvement with Nazism, how he isn't a Nazi philosopher, but what does it look like for you?
Yeah, well, I think what's come out as a result of the recent materials, the seminars from the mid-30s, lecture courses, much of which, and new volumes of correspondence, is that his philosophical and intellectual solidarity with the movement was certainly more persistent and longer lived than we've been led to believe. I'll give you a quick example, which doesn't really answer your question in a way, but
Go ahead.
The usual line on Heidegger's involvement until very recently, it might be the case often enough, right, even now, is that, okay, he was rector Freiburg University for a year. His attempts to assume a role of national leadership, national philosophical leadership, foundered for whatever reasons. And he decided he was unsuited for politics. He resigned. Actually, there's false information about this. Some of his supporters put out the word that he'd resigned already in February of 1934, which isn't true. He resigned in April. We have his correspondence as rector. And one of the reasons he resigned was because he was getting a lot of flack from his colleagues, most of whom were traditional German conservatives and didn't appreciate this kind of radicalism, which is destroying the university, was letting Nazi students take over in many respects. So that was a source of disappointment and frustration for him. But 2 weeks after he resigned as rector, he joined an organization, the Academy of German Law, that was led by Hitler's personal lawyer and a leader of the Nazi Party at the Reich level, Hans Frank, who also became a Nuremberg war criminal. You could know it at the time, but it's not hard to project either if you look at his writings and views. Heidegger joined this committee, this high-powered committee called the Committee on Philosophy of Law, for which there were obviously very high hopes. It was an all-star committee comprised of academics, Carl Schmitt, lesser known in the Anglo-American world, Hans Fryer, the sociologist, the philosopher Erich Rothacker. There was another leading member of the Nazi Party. It's hard to believe. There are only 16 members of this committee. Alfred Rosenberg, the ideology czar of the Nazi Party, who wrote The Myth of the 20th Century, was on this committee. We know Heidegger attended the first meeting on May 3rd, 1934, at the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar, because he signed the guest book. His name is in the guest book, and he received a personal tour of the Nietzsche Archive from Nietzsche's Machiavellian sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, who was then 85 or 86 years old. It's a pretty incredible story. So he was seeking to get involved on another level right after he resigned as rector. He hadn't given up his hopes. And there are writings from this period that express his continued support. To cut to the chase here, I think Heidegger, to the end of his life, you mentioned quite aptly that you're looking for some kind of act of distancing on Heidegger's part from what happened during this terrible time, from 33 to 45. And the remarks we find in the Black Notebooks are very disappointing. But more importantly, in 1935, in this lecture course, Introduction to Metaphysics, he talks about the inner truth and greatness of National Socialism as opposed to the debased value philosophies that are being tossed about in its name. So I think this tells us a lot. Namely, it suggests that till the end of his life, and I've seen nothing to contradict this bit of conjecture, that Heidegger indeed operated with this opposition between the real potential, the inner truth and greatness of, that's the phrase verbatim, of National Socialism, and those individuals and those inferior approaches to philosophy and ideology that kind of drove the movement into the ground and ruined this potential for real greatness. I don't think Heidegger ever abandoned this conviction.
Yeah, it's the story you told was really, really fascinating. So this is more of a technical question, but I think important because you mentioned it at different points in various chapters in your book, is how Heidegger had much of his works edited and re-edited to take certain parts out, and then some were more clearly anti-Semitic and showing some allegiance to Nazism. I guess how widespread was this in his works, and is it fair to say that were the editors just well-meaning and diligent? I mean, can we get them involved here too and say, hey, you were complicit in this, or should we kind of leave them out of it? And I mean, how much of this is some human error from certain notes? I guess the question I'm having on that is that maybe some people in the conversation will or excuse me, listeners that are listening to the conversation will say, well, wait a minute, you keep saying these things are coming out. And so maybe I know a little bit about this, but you can explain how this happens. I'm assuming there's the, not society, whoever owns Heidegger's materials, the original copies. And then there's lots of things that haven't been released yet. And then there's a deal of translation. So if you know German, then they're released. And are they released to the general public or just to academics? On and on. Maybe you can just briefly summarize how that kind of works, but then talk about this idea of editing and re-editing that was taken out, or that was done to take out certain clearly anti-Semitic stuff in the works.
Well, the problem started with the fact that responsibility for his manuscripts became, quote unquote, or was de facto a family business.
Mm.
And responsibility for typing up his lectures and seminar notes fell to his brother, Fritz. The correspondence came out a few years ago. It's not pretty, and it's highly selected. We don't really know what the full correspondence looks like. We did find out that already in December 1931, Heidegger gave Fritz a copy of what he called the Hitler book for Christmas. Okay, this is already in 31, so he'd read Mein Kampf, 2 years or 15 months before the Nazi siege of power. But what's really macabre about this letter is that he ends it by telling Fritz that I'm giving you this gift in keeping with the spirit of the season. You really want to choke at that point, but anyway, it's anecdotal, but sometimes anecdotes speak volumes at the same time. But I think that the question of the estate, it's a real mess. It's a real embarrassment. Let me just mention, I'm sitting in Berlin right now, as I told you before,
Mm-hmm.
and last year, so 2022, the Heidegger's publisher, Victoria Klostermann in Frankfurt, pulped 2 volumes of the collected works edition because of errors that were really omissions, significant political omissions. Some had to do with anti-Semitism. These weren't accidents. These were left out intentionally. And so he had to destroy these 2 volumes and put in new volumes. Now, these will never be, the problem will never be resolved in the translations in every language one can imagine, virtually, because it's just going to be too expensive for publishers in English, Italian, French, Japanese, Chinese. All of these nations are very concerned with Heidegger's thought. The omissions will stand for all eternity. Students will read these volumes as such. And one has to remember here, just to bring this to a close, the biographical stakes involved. Heidegger was banned for teaching for 5 years. At first, in 45. At first, it was indefinite. It wasn't clear he'd be reinstated. It ended up lasting for 5 years, and it wasn't clear. He had a nervous breakdown, which is sad, because his whole project seemed to along with the regime itself, seemed to have collapsed. So it wasn't clear how he was going to kind of climb back into the saddle, so to speak. So part of the constitutive editing of his texts by sympathetically disposed editors, by himself, we have testimony to this effect, and by family members such as Fritz and his son, Hermann, who also died a few years ago, was the official keeper of the papers, Heidegger's literary estate. They made sure that certain documents didn't appear. And I'll just end because I talk about this in the book. I want to give everything away, but in a couple of key instances, the only reason that specific seminars or lecture courses or letters were eventually published by Klostermann or by another press was that the keepers of the estate in the German literary archive in a city called Marbach gave researchers the wrong dossier, the wrong file, and in a couple of cases, they couldn't cite from them legally, but they copied out the material and let it be known in public what was in these exchanges of letters, what was in these seminar courses, and to not to put too fine a point out, but embarrassed Heidegger's literary supervisors or editors to come out and publish it, because otherwise the word had gotten out that they were suppressing these materials. Okay. So that's another aspect aside from the conscious omission of specific passages. And we have testimony by some of his research assistants as to how this was done. So I do spend some time on this because I think people in the English-speaking world should know what happened. It's not a pretty story.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, like you said, it's a mess. It certainly sounds like a mess. There's kind of along with this thematically, I guess, you mentioned in the book, which I thought was interesting, and I'm curious for your thoughts here on this. So there seems to be there's the text itself. So we've talked a little about. I mean, we've done the autobiographical stuff. We know what's there. Unfortunately, there's some of the political stuff. There's certainly some of the some of, I guess, intentions, etc., and then some of this more technical stuff in terms of editing, re-editing. I guess in terms of interpretive differences, so specifically, you say that many Heidegger scholars will say that Heidegger shunned race thinking. This fascination on how we could use this idea of race thinking, which was maybe more unfortunately in vogue at the time, but then he's talking about like you mentioned, you talk about Jews in a certain way, talk about this anti-race, all this seemingly contradiction. So is he what in your vantage point, what do you think is going on there? Because it does seem like a contradiction, and of course, right? I mean, can you really know what was going on, or was he cherry picking of sorts? Or do people cherry pick like this idea of, well, see, he was condemning and shunning race thinking, but then he's also saying all these other things about different folks. What can we make of this?
Well, I think it's an important question because it's in a way it's not a contradiction if one realizes that there were competing strands of race thinking in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. It's certainly true for Mussolini's Italy. We associate Nazi Germany with kind of hardcore, if you will, biological race thinking. And Heidegger was opposed to biological race thinking because it was reminiscent of 19th century scientific thought. And he was a critic of this paradigm from the standpoint of his early existentialism, et cetera, and notion of Dasein, and which is one of his real breakthroughs. But there was a competing paradigm, very prominent in Italy, and it was actually embraced by a number of leading European fascist intellectuals, people like Paul de Man. Actually, he was quite young at the time, but his uncle, Henri de Man, was a leading European socialist in the 20s, Belgian, and highly respected, began a correspondence with Mussolini in the early 30s and became a fascist and a supporter of collaboration with Nazism, with the Nazis after 1940, the invasion. So there's this paradigm of spiritual fascism. It was very popular in France. Why? Really simple, because the Germans seem to do the biological version, so we're going to do something more, exalted and more aesthetically grand. These were the files of Charles Maurras and Action Française. No less lethal, fundamentally, and no less anti-Semitic, but when you start breaking down the nature of National Socialist race thinking, you take a look it wasn't especially consistent. So, Hitler wasn't a systematic thinker. There was no Nazi dogma that would expel you, excommunicate you from the party if you didn't adhere to a certain plank. Implicitly, you needed to be an anti-Semite or against Jews, etc. But no one submitted you to a test every 6 months, and so forth. So what's important here is that, to take a good example, it's the one I use in the book. If you look at this text by Alfred Rosenberg, The Myth of the 20th Century, which was considered after Mein Kampf the leading statement of Nazi ideology, although one should say that according to lore, Hitler never read it. Why did he need to read about an ideology that he basically conceived? but it's filled with notions like a race soul and a race mysticism. So it's kind of hard to get that from cell biology or genetics. So the whole thing was a mess. It wasn't scientifically valid. There were scientists, of course, all over the world who tried to make it work, and eugenics was, of course, popular in the Anglo-American world and everywhere, but it really didn't have a scientific basis. So you got lucid. One of the major currents of race thinking in Nazi Germany was physical anthropology, which is just guesswork. You look at these photos of people, they look different. You try to typecast them as members of different races. I mean, in retrospect, it's laughable had it not been the basis for the reorganization of Europe under Nazi hegemony, where races were Slavs, et cetera, were characterized as, Untermenschen, or inferior. So unfortunately, there was a lot of leeway for different ways of interpreting race.
Yeah, it's again complicated. I guess the one other thing here is kind of go back to the big themes, and then we can finish up with some of the more modern stuff here. But one of the big themes that I guess for me, and I think maybe for other folks, is how much. So two points. One, how much of all of this terrible ways of thinking about people and people groups is, how much is the well been poisoned, right? Can I read about worldhood? Can I read about Dasein? Can I read about being in the world? And got to be all worried that I'm kind of smuggling in anti-Semitic notions. I think that's where most people get nervous about this stuff, and it's an important question. And then I guess second to that is, and there's some work that's been done on this with Nietzsche, and again, there's a lot of interpretive things there, and we won't get into Nietzsche here because it's, we're talking about Heidegger. But as an example, I found that a lot of, and I guess you could do this with any philosopher, but a lot of these philosophers, we take a lot of the kind of the good stuff that we like, right? A lot of the works of wisdom or things of ontology or things of phenomenology, and that's great. But what I've learned in an accurate reading is these guys are a product of their time, and a lot of them are doing political thinking. Now, it might not be direct, straight political philosophy, but Nietzsche has a lot of political ideas in his philosophy. And to read Nietzsche has to be understanding the context he lived in and the political statements he's making. I mean, he wasn't a great fan of democracy, right? and many other things. So the same here with Heidegger. How much generally you can read all of those things, but can you or should you? You can answer that, but or how would we separate his political ideas from his actual core elements of philosophy? That many will say, well, yeah, he's part of the Nazi Party, but I'm reading about being in the world. I'm not reading about, what the National Socialist Party was doing. How do we divorce that, or do we not? How do you make of this?
Yeah, that's obviously an important and troubling question. Let me, before answering it explicitly, let me step back for a second and address something you said in the context of your remarks with which I agree. Nietzsche, it's not, politics along the lines of voting and organizing political parties, canvassing, it's writing op-ed pieces, et cetera. It's something much more. He called it great politics, so it's metapolitics, so it's aiming at something greater. Right. Now, in both cases, you mentioned, and it's accurate, that they were persons of their time. And Heidegger is a philosopher of temporality, and in German, it's Zeitlichkeit, and historicity. So this is important too, in another respect, in terms of his self-understanding. But one must also be frank, and this isn't to contradict what you said at all. But there's a spectrum of views in this time period. Certainly. Some people were dissidents, and of course, some people were communists, and some were social democrats. Not very many were ardent Republicans in Germany for various historical reasons, but one of which was the Versailles Treaty, of course, and its unfair treatment. But there was a spectrum. I mean, Hannah Arendt says, I think you allude to this in one of your questions, that in this Apologia she wrote, well, of course they were lovers, so the heart, has its attachments, which I think we all understand. Heidegger didn't live in his time. His thinking is a wind that blows from 2,000 years ago, et cetera. Well, it doesn't, first of all, it wasn't true, because we know from the Black Notebooks and from the letters that he wrote in the early 30s, especially, how he subscribed to the Nazi newspaper, the Volksschau Bacher. He kept up with current events. He was an observer. The being, I just read something along these lines today. Maybe this is why it's kind of sticking in my craw a little bit. In fact, I'm supposed to go to a city in Germany tomorrow where Heidegger taught for Marburg and respond to some papers. And one of the presenters starts off by saying, yeah, Heidegger was caught up in the complexities of his time. Again, there's no question of responsibility. There's no question of taking responsibility. There's no independence or individuality. It's, the Germans used to have, fortunately they're much better now, this rationalization for what happened here. I'm in Berlin between 1933 and 1945. They would call it was like an accident that occurs in business, but they have one word to describe this: a Betriebsunfall, a business accident. It was just, these things happen. That really doesn't do justice to the decisions that were made and the other possibilities and the roads not taken. But to come back to being in the world, Dasein, being with all these categories, there's no way that his ideological enthusiasms of the 30s cancels this out, even if he's talking in Division 2 of Being in Time above folk and generation, community, whatever. It would be short-sighted and anti-intellectual, anti-philosophical to try to dismiss a book like this on these premises. We have too many eyewitnesses who went on to become significant philosophers who attest to the nature of this book as a breakthrough. So, but that doesn't really answer the question. And the answer to the question really means, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but it means doing the work. It really means examining the categories, not for hidden ideological valences, but in terms of a more general project that was tied to history and historicity, and how Heidegger thought about these categories, and how he thought that his fundamental ontology could address the problem of nihilism and the crisis of civilization. We have that in the first half of Being in Time with the depiction of Das Man, the they, and the inauthenticity. So what's the relationship between inauthenticity and authenticity? How do we get out of this morass of that's a bit simplistic, I admit. But what are how does one get from Division 1 to Division 2, from inauthenticity to authenticity? We have to just, we need to treat Heidegger like any other thinker we read, like as critically, as someone who can be discussed in a group of intelligent peers, and we can trade views and insights, which we do presumably with any other thinker or philosopher or opinion writer, etc. He has to be subject to the same type of criterion and scrutiny. Just this conference I'm going to tomorrow. My wife is German, and she sees this. She sees through this. It's like, they many of them they've been reading Heidegger for years, if not decades, and Yeah, I mean, it's tragic. He's human. He had flaws. He had failings, et cetera, et cetera. But they still fall back on admitting this. They fall back on the fundamental categories uncritically. They don't engage with the nature of the concepts. I'm not even talking about criticizing them on political or ideological grounds. I'm just talking about working through them as we should do with any text. So. Sorry, I've just been reading some of these papers before, and it's like, you come out with the admission that he got caught up in the zeitgeist, but still, we have these findings, the criticism of technology, et cetera, that are the key to understanding the modern world, et cetera. Were it only that simple.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I look, I think no one is beyond criticism for your ideas and for everything else, and I think it's totally fair to say like, hey, you have some good ideas about ontology or phenomenology, but what also do we see as a critique of it as well? And that's even removing any of the autobiographical stuff as well. So I would agree with you there. Um, so briefly, but before you head off, I know it's late over there. Is two questions. So it's basically the same question, but just I'll kind of generalize it first. So you talk I think it's the last chapter in the book about the new right today, which has been obviously in the U.S. and then obviously in Europe as well, places like France and Italy and a lot of other and in the AFD in Germany and et cetera, many places in Hungary. I think so. A lot of places on the new right today in Europe and then obviously in the U.S. So maybe you could kind of give, I mean, is it fair to say that modern day extremism can tie it back to Heidegger? Is that a fair thing to say? You can maybe generally answer that. And then I do want to ask you, because you spent a few pages on it about Dugin and his philosophy. So maybe tackle the new right thing, and then we'll tackle Dugin.
Well, Dugin's the Russian representative of the new right, and one can trace the affiliations very, very closely from once communism collapsed in '89. He began traveling in the West, and he met French leaders of the French Nouvelle Droite or New Right, like Alain de Benoist, and Italy. He met the Nazi Maoists, Claudio Muti, and it wasn't easy to get some of these texts in Russia during communism. So the link is very correct. But I don't want to mislead readers or your listeners. I'm not making this Machiavellian argument that Heidegger somehow behind the new right, or that the new right in its various incarnations, the alt-right in the U.S., I mentioned the Nouvelle Droite in France, which was the really first sophisticated form of a post-fascist right in the 60s, coming out of the Algerian War, et cetera. And you mentioned correctly the AFD, the Alternative for Germany, here. And in Germany, it's the Neue Rechte. Austria, they have a different branch, and a prominent right-wing party, the FPO, misnamed the Austrian Freedom Party, and this identitarian movement. But I think from the discussions of my book, one can see why it would be plausible for, after the fact, for these people who try to present intentiously and consciously a more intellectually sophisticated, hence palatable, hence acceptable to a middle range of, the middle class, really, moderate people who are heretofore moderate version of post-fascism or neo-fascism, why they might rely on Heidegger's thinking for prestige, certainly. He's often considered to be the leading philosopher of the 20th century, but also one can ground one's, ethno-nationalist convictions in Heideggerian concepts such as rootedness in soil, and kindred concepts, etc. Also, but very importantly, his critique of enlightenment and his critique of the Western democracies as nihilistic. I mean, it's a standpoint that he took from both Nietzsche and Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West is very important. So, I don't want to go on a limb and claim there's a copy of Being in Time under the pillow of all these people. But, and at first your tendency is these interpreters aren't especially sophisticated either, even the German ones, sophisticated interpreters of Heidegger. But there's just so, in all these contexts, I wanted to write a short chapter on this problem. And then you have Dugin in a Russian context, whose name was on the front page of newspapers around the world last August and before, but with this unfortunate targeting of his daughter for assassination. He was the obvious target. But one shouldn't exaggerate his role in Russian foreign policy. But for over 20 years, he's been an obstreperous ideologue, embracing the idea of Eurasianism and Russia's right to mastery of the heartland. This geopolitical thinking he lectured to the Russian Academy of the General Staff in the late 90s. And it took a while for Putin to figure out where he stood. He's been in office for 24 years. Whether or not he needed an ideology. But as I try to point out in the book, it's quite telling that in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the incursions in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, he began using this phrase of Eurasianism. Now, Dugin's not the only one who's used it to justify Russia's entitlement to geopolitical intervention in this part of the world. The Heidegger connection comes in with Heidegger's Heidegger's thinking, as I try to claim in the book, at least in the 30s, was Germanocentric, with this German salvation consciousness of saving the world. Dugin agrees with Heidegger's framework, but claims that Heidegger had the wrong country. It's not Germany lost after all, but it's Mother Russia. That's the nation that's going to do this. So, that view, I mean, all nationalisms are unfortunate in this respect, but some are more unfortunate than others, and more predatory than others, as we've seen. So, this bears analogy. He is the self-styled leading Russian interpreter of Heidegger. He writes books on Heidegger. They're bad books, but in a way that's beside the point. It's the what we learn from the affinities he perceives between his ethno-populist, ethno-nationalist views and Heidegger that are rather telling.
Yeah. Again, I'm loosely familiar with him, and I know he's got a certain kind of philosophy as a kind of fourth way, I forget what the name of it is, or
Right.
something like that.
Right.
And I'm not close to it, and I don't, but I've loosely read it, and there's a lot of nationalism in there. It's a lot of nationalism in there, and I think more of the worrying kind, the maybe pernicious type than the just feel good about your country type. But it is interesting how Heidegger continues to get used. So the last question I have here is, so what do we do with Heidegger? What do we do with him, right? This is the continuous question here, and I'm not expecting a kind of knock it out of the park kind of answer here per se, but can we and should we still engage with Heidegger's ideas on their merits, whether it's on his essays on technology, whether it's the stuff in Being in Time, whether it's whatever it may be, or do all of the things you talk about in the book and have talked about here, his personal beliefs, taint him too much, where we shouldn't read Heidegger, we should ban his stuff, no one should read it? and maybe I'm making too much of a false dichotomy here, but what do we do with Heidegger, and more specifically, what do we do with reading and studying his ideas for college students or people in grad school or folks like that, or just a casual person? How should we treat it?
Yeah. Well, I've had some of these discussions along this line since the book has come out. And, to take one extreme that you mentioned, not that you as a possibility. I mean, the last thing we'd want to do would be to ban Heidegger, you know, uh, or to put some kind of quarantine on his work because of its association with National Socialism. That would be unfortunate. That would be anti-intellectual and, in fact, discriminatory. And I don't think serious readers or thinkers would want to go down that path. Some of the conversations I've had with philosophers, I had a really interesting discussion. Someone who teaches and writes on Heidegger at a university in the Northeast. Yeah, he wanted to have a Zoom session with me a couple of weeks after the book came out. He was really troubled. He worked on the early Heidegger. I think he'd done some translation. And he asked basically more or less the same question you just asked. It's like, is this okay? I mean, he said, tell me what you think. I really want to know. Am I barking up the wrong tree? And I said, well, he was talking about some lectures Heidegger had given that he and a colleague had discovered in the archive from the mid-20s before being in time. And, I just said succinctly, believe it or not, I don't think there's a great concern about ideological taint to this text in this period. It's mostly concerned with interpreting, Greek philosophy and along his lines that, I wouldn't have any real qualms about this, but I can see how people will read my book and get another impression. So what I tell, I've had some discussions with philosophers, about the path forward, so to speak. And all I'd say at this point is like, well, teach both aspects, teach both sides, do what you've been doing, integrate Heidegger in the sequence in the history of 20th century philosophy or however phenomenology, but also do due diligence for the extent of his compromises and shall we say delusions during the 1930s. Don't suppress or falsify the depth of his Germanocentrism at the time. And I think the point you mentioned 30 minutes ago, Xavier, is really important one, is that unlike his compagnon de route, fellow philosopher Karl Jaspers, who wrote this book on the guilt question of German guilt, 1946, Heidegger never came out with an explicit self-distancing from the regime, any kind of criticism. He didn't really do the work or care about doing the work in terms of examining some of the failings of, shall we say, German historical and political development that might have led to 1933, not teleologically, but de facto. It didn't happen overnight, and there was no, iron necessity leading to this Nazi seizure power. But have your students come away from the class being informed, young people or citizens, because it's an opportunity to learn about this. Even if you're not a historian, you don't need to be a historian. Historians get too ensconced in detail often. They don't see sometimes the forest for the trees. Yeah. But it is an opportunity. What was he thinking? We have these political texts. Where do they stand in the movement? You could spend one class on it, and the students would reflect on it. And given your penultimate question, your previous question about the currency of the new right today, and all the Hungary, et cetera, and all the inroads it's making around the globe, this is an important topic to address. The continuities and discontinuities between historical fascism and whatever you want to call it, authoritarian populism. The far right is somewhat neo-fascist. They want to cover it up because fascism left a series of genocides, and parts of Europe were turned into a cemetery. So it didn't have a good rep at the end. Look at the photographs of German cities. The small villages, most of which weren't bombed, are beautiful. I've gotten the opportunity to visit some, but the major cities like Berlin and Hamburg, were pretty much leveled. So they're that's one of the reasons they go to the conservative revolutionaries, figures like Heidegger and Schmidt and Junger and Spengler, as an intellectually acceptable form of this discourse. Although, some of those figures were pretty close to Nazism and supported it. So it's troubling, especially in Schmidt's case.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's interesting. I think sometimes people's intentions are questioned, and sometimes that might be fair. But I talked to a lot of historians on the podcast, and when certain historians will write something about, it doesn't get couched this way anymore, but there's a kind of a new, not a new history, but a history we don't hear often. There's like the main narrative that we hear all the time, but a lot of the times it's what else was going on in the world, and I think the same thing with Heidegger is true. Is you shouldn't be. I mean, I understand why for people that first learn this, it makes them a little queasy, right? It's like, okay, we're going to read this guy that was part of the Nazi party. Like, maybe we shouldn't do that. And, what I say is you should read everything, and you should have an understanding of how things are complicated and people are complicated, and judge the ideas on their merits, and condemn the wrongful beliefs, or if that's your values or your morals or ethics, and hold two things in your head at once. And I think Heidegger has no shortage of that. So it's definitely always a kind of wrestling kind of thing. Well, the book is called Heidegger In Ruins: Between Philosophy and Ideology. It's out everywhere through Yale University Press. Where's the best places to find you online, or any websites or anything that people can find you outside of the book, or anything that's important?
Yeah, I think probably the best place is through my university, the Graduate Center of City University. Anyone who I've gotten some interesting comments via email about the book. And, I'd encourage readers, if they want to pass along their thoughts, I'd be happy to read them and respond. Yeah,
of course. Well, Richard, I mean, this was so much fun. I really, really enjoy talking about these ideas and Heidegger's work, and I enjoyed your book. And so I was very honored to have you come on and chat about it for a good bit. So big thanks. I'm really appreciative for you doing that.
Thank you, Xavier. I enjoyed it very much myself.
Yes, thank you.